There exists within the Western esoteric tradition a peculiar preoccupation with transformation, not merely the transformation of base metals into gold, but something far more elusive and infinitely more valuable. The alchemists of medieval and Renaissance Europe did not labor in their laboratories solely for material wealth. Their true opus, concealed beneath layers of cryptic symbolism and deliberately obscure language, was the transformation of the human soul itself. When Carl Gustav Jung encountered the alchemical texts in the early decades of the 20th century, he recognized something that centuries of rationalist dismissal had obscured. These were not the ravings of deluded proto-chemists, but sophisticated psychological documents. The alchemists had encoded within their seemingly absurd recipes and bizarre illustrations a map of inner transformation that paralleled his own discoveries about the structure and development of the psyche. The genesis of this recognition came to Jung during a period of profound personal crisis. Following his break with Freud and his subsequent descent into what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, Jung found himself navigating psychological territories for which modern psychology had no adequate maps. It was in the alchemical texts, particularly the works attributed to figures like Hermes Trismegistus, Paracelsus, and the anonymous authors of treatises like the Rosarium Philosophorum, that he discovered a language capable of articulating the process he himself was undergoing. The Magnum Opus, or Great Work, represented the entirety of the alchemical process. Traditionally divided into 4 major stages, Nigredo, Albedo, Citrinitas, and Rubido, this sequence described the systematic dissolution, purification, and reconstitution of prima materia, the base matter with which the alchemist began. But Jung perceived that this prima materia was not lead or mercury. It was the unrealized self, the undifferentiated psyche in its raw, unconscious state. The stages were not chemical operations, but psychological transformations that every individual who embarks upon the path of genuine self-knowledge must navigate. This is not a journey for those seeking comfort or easy answers. The alchemical work demands everything. One's illusions, one's cherished self-concepts, one's very identity must be submitted to the fire. What emerges if one possesses the fortitude to complete the work is not the person who began, but something fundamentally transformed, integrated, conscious, whole. To understand the alchemical magnum opus as Jung interpreted it, one must first grasp the fundamental architecture of the psyche as he conceived it. Jung's psychology rests upon several foundational principles that distinguish it sharply from other depth psychological systems. First, there is the proposition that the psyche possesses an inherent drive toward wholeness, what Jung termed the individuation process. Unlike Freud's vision of the psyche as fundamentally driven by instinctual forces requiring repression and sublimation, Jung saw the unconscious not merely as a repository of repressed content, but as a creative, purposive force actively engaged in the production of psychological development. The psyche seeks balance, integration, and the realization of its latent potentialities. Second, Jung distinguished between the personal unconscious, comprising forgotten memories, repressed experiences, and subliminal perceptions unique to the individual, and the collective unconscious, a deeper stratum of the psyche containing universal patterns of psychological functioning he called archetypes. These archetypes are not inherited ideas, but inherited possibilities for ideas, structural elements of the psyche that shape how we experience fundamental human situations: birth, death, the mother, the father, the hero's journey, transformation itself. The alchemical opus maps directly onto this conception of psychological development. The alchemist's laboratory becomes an external representation of an internal process. The vessels, furnaces, and chemical operations are projections of intrapsychic dynamics. When the alchemist speaks of dissolving lead in aqua regia, Jung understood this as describing the dissolution of calcified ego structures in the corrosive waters of unconscious content. When texts describe the conjunction of sun and moon, king and queen, sulfur and mercury, they are describing the union of conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, active and receptive principles within the psyche. Jung's genius lay in recognizing that the apparently bizarre symbolism of alchemy followed consistent patterns across different authors, times and places because it emerged from the collective unconscious itself. Alchemists were not consciously creating a system of psychological transformation. They were discovering it, observing it in their own psychic processes, and projecting it onto matter because they lacked a language of introspection adequate to describe what they were experiencing. The doctrine central to both alchemy and Jungian psychology is that transformation requires descent before ascent, dissolution before coagulation, death before rebirth. The ego, the center of conscious identity, must undergo a kind of death. This is not literal physical death, but the death of identification with limited partial conceptions of oneself. The ego discovers that it is not the whole of the psyche, but merely a component within a larger system. This discovery is simultaneously humbling and liberating. The stages of the Magnum Opus represent a systematic methodology for this transformation. They are not arbitrary divisions, but reflect actual phenomenological stages in psychological development, stages that can be observed in clinical work, in the lives of creative individuals undergoing periods of productive disintegration and reconstitution, and in traditional initiatory systems across cultures. Jung insisted that this process could not be forced or rushed. It unfolds according to its own timing, guided by what he called the self, the archetype of wholeness, and the regulating center of the total psyche. The ego's task is not to control this process, but to consciously participate in it, to endure the necessary suffering it entails, and to integrate the insights and energies that emerge from the unconscious depths. The alchemists encoded this understanding in the dictum, Ora lege, 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 relege, labora et invenies. Pray, read, reread, work, and you will find. The emphasis on repetition, on persistent engagement with the work, on both contemplation and action, reflects the understanding that transformation is not achieved through a single insight or experience, but through sustained, patient engagement with the process over time. This is the architectural principle. The psyche is self-organizing and teleological, moving toward integration and wholeness. But this movement requires conscious participation, sustained effort, and the willingness to endure the destruction of partial identities in service of a larger realization. The 4 stages of the alchemical Magnum Opus, Negrado, Albedo, CITRINITAS, and Rubido, constitute a sequential process of psychological transformation that Jung spent decades explicating through his clinical work and his studies of comparative religion, mythology, and esoteric traditions. The work begins in darkness. Negrado, the blackening, represents the initial stage of dissolution and decomposition. In alchemical imagery, this is the stage of putrefaction, when the prima materia is subjected to intense heat and begins to break down into its constituent elements. Visually, alchemical texts depict this stage through images of death. Skeletons, graves, crows, blackened matter, the setting sun. Psychologically, Negrado corresponds to what Jung called the encounter with the shadow. The shadow comprises those aspects of ourselves we have rejected, repressed, or never consciously acknowledged, the qualities we find unacceptable in ourselves and consequently project onto others. The shadow contains not only negative qualities, but also positive potentials that were suppressed during socialization, because they conflicted with the persona, the social mask we construct to navigate the world. The Negrado phase is typically precipitated by a crisis, the collapse of a cherished belief system, the failure of a life strategy, the eruption of symptoms, depression, anxiety, psychosomatic illness that can no longer be ignored. The structures of meaning by which we have organized our lives prove inadequate, the ego's control loosens, and contents from the unconscious begin to surface. This is a profoundly disorienting experience. The individual feels lost, fragmented, without direction. Depression is common in this phase, not the depression of simple chemical imbalance, but the depression of confronting the inadequacy of one's previous mode of existence. The alchemists called this the Negrado melancholia, and they understood it not as a pathology to be eliminated, but as a necessary stage in the work. In clinical terms, this is when an individual might enter therapy reporting that everything has fallen apart. Relationships dissolve, Careers lose their meaning. The activities that once brought satisfaction now feel empty. The temptation in this phase is to seek quick restoration of the previous equilibrium, to find a new relationship, to replace the old, to throw oneself into work, to medicate away the discomfort. But the alchemical work requires enduring this phase, allowing the old structures to fully dissolve. Jung noted that many people never move beyond Negrado. They experience the dissolution, but lack the stamina or guidance to continue through to integration. They remain in a state of chronic depression or cynicism, unable to reconstitute themselves. The work requires what the alchemists called philosophical patience, the capacity to sit with chaos and darkness without premature attempts at resolution. From the blackened matter of Negrado emerges a subtle transformation. Albido, the whitening, represents purification and the initial emergence of clarity. Alchemically, this stage involves washing, distillation, and separation, the extraction of pure essence from corrupted matter. The imagery shifts from darkness to dawn, from death to glimmers of life. The moon becomes the dominant symbol, representing reflected light, the illumination that comes from working with the unconscious material that has been brought to awareness. Psychologically, albedo represents the beginning of differentiation and objectification. The shadow material that erupted during Negrado is now examined, sorted, and partially integrated. The individual develops what Jung called psychological mindedness, the capacity to observe oneself, to recognize patterns, to distinguish between ego and unconscious content. This is the phase of analysis in the clinical sense, the careful examination of dreams, symptoms, and behavioral patterns. It is a cooling phase after the intense heat of Negrado, characterized by reflection rather than raw experience. The individual begins to develop a relationship with the unconscious, to recognize its communications, to understand the symbolic language through which it operates. In albedo, one encounters the anima or animus, the contrasexual archetype that serves as the psyche's bridge to the collective unconscious. For men, the anima appears in dreams and fantasies as feminine figures. For women, the animus appears as masculine figures. These are not simply gendered stereotypes, but represent the compensatory opposite of one's conscious orientation. The anima brings feeling, intuition, and connection to the unconscious, to men who have identified primarily with rational, instrumental consciousness. The animus brings structure, discrimination, and logos to women whose ego development has emphasized relationship and feeling. The danger in albedo is remaining in a state of passive reflection, of endless analysis without integration. One can become fascinated with understanding oneself without actually changing. The alchemists warned against this with the image of the multiplication of operations, the tendency to repeat purifications endlessly without proceeding to the next stage. Some individuals spend decades in therapy, achieving remarkable insight into their patterns, yet never fully transforming them. They understand why they behave as they do, but cannot alter the behavior. Albido provides necessary clarity and separation, but it is inherently incomplete. It is the dawn, not the full day. It is consciousness achieved through negation, through recognizing what one is not, rather than through affirmation of what one is. A further transformation is required. In some alchemical systems, CITRINITAS, the yellowing, is presented as a distinct stage between albedo and rubido, though in later formulations it is sometimes subsumed into rubido itself. Jung recognized it as a crucial transitional phase, the dawning of solar consciousness after the lunar reflections of albedo. Citrinitas represents the emergence of individual meaning and purpose. The purification of albedo has separated out the essential from the inessential, but this creates a new problem. What does one do with this clarity? Albedo gives understanding, Citrinitas gives direction. Psychologically, this stage involves the activation of what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to generate new symbols that unite previously opposed psychological contents. During Negrado and albedo, the individual has encountered and separated out conflicting aspects of the personality. Citrinitas is the phase when these conflicts begin to be resolved not through suppression of one side or the other, but through the emergence of a third position that transcends the opposition. This is often experienced as the discovery of one's vocation in the deepest sense, not merely a career but a calling, a sense of individual purpose that emerges from within rather than being imposed from without. The person who has completed CITRINITAS knows why they exist, what their particular contribution to the world is meant to be. They have moved from adaptation to societal expectations to authentic individual expression. The imagery of Citrinitas is solar, but not yet at full strength. It is the yellow of sunrise, of gold in its early stages of formation. There is illumination, but not yet the full radiance of completion. The individual has found their path, but has not yet fully embodied it. There is knowing, but not yet complete being. Rubido, the reddening, represents the culmination and completion of the Magnum Opus. Alchemically, this is the stage when the philosopher's stone is achieved, when the work of transformation is complete. The imagery is of fire, blood, the rising sun at its zenith, the red king crowned in glory. Psychologically, Rubido represents full individuation, the realization of the self. The individual has integrated shadow, anima or animus, and the various archetypal contents of the collective unconscious. They have achieved what Jung called the union of opposites, the conjunctio oppositorum. Conscious and unconscious are no longer in conflict, but work together in creative tension. The person who has achieved Rubido lives from the self rather than merely from the ego. Their actions flow from their essential nature rather than from adaptation to external demands or internal compulsions. They have achieved what the alchemists called the philosophical gold, not material wealth but the incorruptible essence of realized human nature. This is not a static state of perfection, but a dynamic equilibrium. The individuated person remains fully human, still subject to error and limitation, but they possess a center of gravity that remains stable regardless of external circumstances. They have achieved what the Stoics called apatheia and the Buddhists equanimity, not absence of emotion but freedom from being controlled by emotion. Rubido is rare. Jung estimated that few individuals achieve complete individuation, though many make significant progress along the path. The work of a lifetime, it often accelerates in the second half of life, when questions of meaning become more pressing than questions of achievement and adaptation. No account of the alchemical process would be complete without acknowledging its most perilous aspect, the mortificatio, the death that must be endured in service of rebirth. This is not metaphorical death, but a genuine encounter with annihilation, a crisis in which the individual's very sense of existence is threatened. Jung's own experience during his confrontation with the unconscious between 1913 and 1917 exemplifies this crisis. Following his break with Freud, Jung found himself assailed by visions, fantasies, and psychological states that bordered on psychosis. He experienced what he called a stream of lava emerging from the unconscious, threatening to overwhelm his conscious personality entirely. He recorded these experiences in what would eventually be published as the Red Book, a document that reads more like the testament of a mystic than a clinical psychologist. What Jung discovered during this ordeal was that the descent into the unconscious, while necessary for transformation, carries genuine risks. The ego can be overwhelmed. The individual can lose their moorings in consensus reality and be swept away into psychosis. The alchemists understood this danger and encoded it in warnings about the volatility of the work, about the necessity of maintaining the seal on the vessel, about not opening the furnace prematurely. The existential crisis that accompanies genuine psychological transformation differs qualitatively from ordinary depression or anxiety. It is an encounter with the groundlessness of existence, with the arbitrariness of the meanings by which we organize our lives, with the face of death not as a distant event, but as an ever-present reality that strips away all pretense and artifice. Kierkegaard called this the sickness unto death, a despair that comes from confronting the existential structure of human existence, that we are beings who must create meaning in a universe that provides no inherent meaning, that we are radically free yet finite, that we exist in time and must die. Heidegger termed it anxiety, angst, distinguishing it from fear of particular objects. Anxiety is the mood in which the nothingness at the ground of existence reveals itself. In the alchemical work, this crisis often occurs during the transition from Negrado to Albido, or in a particularly intense form during the conjunctio, the sacred marriage that precedes Rubido. The old self has died, but the new self has not yet stabilized. There is a hiatus, a void, in which the individual exists in a state of suspended animation, neither one thing nor another. Jung observed this crisis repeatedly in his patients. Those who came to him were typically not suffering from simple neurotic symptoms, but from what he called problems of the soul, questions of meaning, purpose, and identity that could not be resolved through adjustment of external circumstances or behavioral techniques. These individuals faced a choice: to retreat to their previous mode of existence, accepting its limitations and the symptoms it produced, or to move forward into the unknown territory of genuine transformation. The temptation to retreat is powerful. The old self, however inadequate, is familiar. The new self is unknown and uncertain. Many people oscillate at this threshold for years, moving forward tentatively and then pulling back when the anxiety becomes too intense. They approach transformation but cannot fully commit to it. The crisis is intensified by the recognition that no external authority can provide the answer. This is perhaps the most isolating aspect of the work. The individual must find their own way. Teachers, therapists, and guides can point toward the path, but they cannot walk it for another. The alchemists insisted on this with their emphasis on direct experience. Believe only what you yourself have experienced and proven true. What sustains an individual through this crisis? Jung identified several factors. First, there must be a fundamental trust in the psyche's own healing capacity, a faith that the process, however chaotic it appears, is meaningful and goal-directed. Second, there must be patience, the willingness to endure the darkness without forcing premature resolution. Third, there must be support, whether from a therapist, a spiritual community, or a tradition that validates the reality of the transformation process. The alchemists also emphasized the necessity of what they called the divine grace, gratia Dei. The work can be prepared for through human effort, but its completion requires something beyond the ego's capacity, an intervention from the self, a gift from the unconscious, a moment of illumination that cannot be willed into existence but only received when conditions are right. This is perhaps the most humbling recognition, that the ego, having done all it can do, must finally surrender control and allow the transformation to complete itself. The crisis of the soul is ultimately a crisis of trust. Can one trust that letting go of control will not result in annihilation, but in rebirth? What emerges from the successful completion of the alchemical opus? What is this new self that the work produces? Jung was careful to avoid presenting individuation as a state of perfection or as the achievement of some idealized self. The individuated person is not superhuman but fully human, which is to say, integrated, conscious, and whole. Integration means that the various aspects of the personality that were previously dissociated or in conflict now function as a coordinated whole. The shadow is not eliminated, but acknowledged, and, where appropriate, expressed in conscious, deliberate ways rather than erupting in unconscious projections and compulsive behaviors. The anima or animus is not repressed, but recognized as a valuable source of insight and connection to the unconscious. The persona, the social mask, is not discarded but understood as a tool to be used flexibly, rather than identified with as one's true nature. The individuated person possesses what Jung called psychological freedom. They are no longer driven by unconscious compulsions, no longer helplessly reactive to external circumstances or internal complexes. They have achieved a measure of autonomy, not in the sense of disconnection from others, but in the sense of self-determination, of being the author of their own life rather than the product of conditioning and circumstance. Critically, this integration produces a shift in one's relationship to suffering. The individuated person does not avoid suffering. They recognize it as an inevitable aspect of existence, but they no longer suffer unconsciously. Their suffering becomes meaningful, understood as part of the larger process of growth and transformation. This is what Nietzsche meant when he wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." The individuated person has found their why. There is also a characteristic shift in values and priorities. The individuated person typically becomes less concerned with external markers of success, wealth, status, recognition, and more concerned with questions of meaning, authenticity, and contribution. Jung noted that many of his patients who achieved significant integration abandoned successful careers in favor of vocations that were less remunerative but more aligned with their deepest values and capacities. The social implications of individuation are complex. On one hand, the individuated person is better equipped to form genuine relationships because they no longer project their unconscious contents onto others or demand that others fulfill functions that belong to their own psyche. On the other hand, individuation often creates distance from conventional society. The person who has undergone deep transformation may find themselves alienated from people still living within consensus assumptions and values. Jung acknowledged this difficulty. Individuation is not a social ideal. It is an individual achievement that may or may not align with collective values. In some cases, the individuated person becomes a leader or teacher, helping others along the path. In other cases, they live quietly, their transformation invisible to those around them but radiating a subtle influence through their very being. The completion of the Magnum Opus does not mean the end of growth or change. Individuation is not a static state achieved once and for all, but a dynamic process that continues throughout life. What changes is that the process becomes conscious rather than unconscious, deliberate rather than compulsive. The individuated person continues to integrate new experiences, to adjust to changing circumstances, to grow, but they do so from a stable center rather than from a position of fragmentation and reactivity. Perhaps the most significant outcome of the alchemical work is the achievement of what Jung called the reality of the psyche. The individuated person knows from direct experience that the psyche is real, not merely an epiphenomenon of brain activity or a collection of learned behaviors, but a substantive reality with its own laws, dynamics, and creative potential. They have experienced the autonomous operations of the unconscious, have received its gifts, have struggled with its demands, and have ultimately established a conscious relationship with it. This recognition fundamentally alters one's relationship to life itself. When one knows that the psyche is real and purposive, that dreams are meaningful, that symptoms carry messages, that crises are opportunities for transformation, existence takes on a quality of depth and significance that is unavailable to those who live solely in the external world of material facts and social conventions. The new self is not a different person, but the same person fully realized. Not the ego inflated to grandiose proportions, but the ego humbled and integrated into a larger totality. It is the fulfillment of the ancient injunction, know thyself. Not the superficial self-knowledge of personality tests and pop psychology, but the profound self-knowledge that comes from having descended into one's own depths, confronted what one finds there, and emerged transformed. The gold you seek is not in the crucible, but in the will that ignites the fire.